It ain't love if you gon' judge me for my past. No, it ain't love if you never read my ass.
After 1,855 days since his last album, we get Kendrick Lamar's final album. Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is an honest and vulnerable exploration of masculinity. This isn't the album we were expecting, but it nonetheless remains topical in this social climate. Kendrick is possibly the greatest lyricist of all time. His album Damn was the first pop and the first hip-hop album to win a Pulitzer Prize. His music builds on extended metaphors, uses vivid imagery, and has some of the most clever wordplay used to tell a story. The story on his latest album is the story of his trauma and his undertaking to heal. The album is an intimate and captivating look at Kendrick's masculinity and the detox it undergoes. If you don't believe me, look at the album cover first. In the forefront, we see Kendrick lovingly holding his daughter while adorning a crown of thorns upon his head. In his back right pocket, we see a pistol that is just visible enough to threaten the audience. In the background, we see his partner Whitney Alfred nursing their infant son. This album cover is both domestic and intimate, but the gun and the chipped paint and the look of stress in Kendrick's face shows a story of pain and disrepair. The album structurally split into two different LPs. The Big Steppers, the story of a braggadocious but troubled man suffering from a messiah complex, and Mr. Morale, the story of a man who comes to terms with his trauma and grows from it. They both are two sides of the same coin, and their narratives bounce back and forth throughout this album. The storytelling is non-linear, very heterodox, and I had to listen to each LP multiple times in order to understand the nuanced story that Kendrick is trying to convey. Kendrick dedicates his album to healing his trauma and all the harm it brings to the people around him. I believe this album is the masculine understanding of mental health and healing. Kendrick leads by example and takes accountability for his shortcomings. His example holds a lot of wisdom for young men and is worth a serious discussion. Kendrick highlights his vices without any pretense or self-justification. He confesses his sins and takes responsibility for all of them. The first track of the album, Kendrick admits to being a spendthrift who buys watches and cars to fill a hole. A common theme in both LPs is the recurring struggle he has with sex addiction. From the first track, where he mentions hooking up with a green-eyed girl to Sex the Pain Away, to his confession on Worldwide Steppers of using sex as a weapon in racial politics. He traces his sex addiction to the sexual abuse he suffered as a child. In the song Mother I Sober, he recounts the harrowing tale of sexual abuse he and his mother suffered while in poverty as a black family. He hints that other rappers in his position, other rappers in the industry, are suffering just like him, and they are medicating their trauma with similar vices. Kendrick thought he was above reproach by staying away from drugs and alcohol, but his sex addiction brought upon by suppressed trauma was his self-destructive coping mechanism. His addiction drove a wedge between him and his partner Whitney Alfred. He felt incredibly guilty because Alfred realized his sex addiction was the result of trauma and empathetically offered him help to find therapy. Kendrick's biggest regret is spitting in her face, lying, and continuing to destroy his life, something Alfred couldn't handle. Alfred is an amazing person, and Kendrick doesn't let us forget that. He repeats again and again how grateful he is to have her in his life. Not many people would understand their partner's sex addiction. Nearly 77% of men in treatment for sex addiction have faced sexual assault in their formative years. When you're abused as a child, your neurons create a pathway to process that trauma and sexual experience. Many victims go to either develop severe depression and antisocial behaviors or engage in sexually risky activities. Alfred's compassion and subsequent absence drove Kendrick to take control of his own destiny and begin the journey to redeem himself. The journey gave birth to this album's duality. The Big Steppers is Kendrick's toxic persona. He views himself as the messiah for rap, a voice of a generation and beyond reproach. Despite his success, he still feels empty and in pain. His arrogance is the shield behind which he hides. That's something he learned from his father. In his track Father Time, he recounts how he had to unlearn the toxic traits from his father, who repeatedly repeatedly chastised him for showing any emotion or vulnerability. The entire album can be read as Kendrick coming to terms with his father's example and being the most vulnerable any person on this planet could possibly be in the ultimate act of rebellion. Kendrick wants to break the cycle and avoid passing on his trauma to his children. Mr. Morale is the therapist who helps Kendrick heal. Mr. Morale is the title of the 16th track of the album as well. Here, Kendrick addresses his infant son Enoch and tells him that while he is weary, he is reformed. He has overcome his trauma and believes himself ready to play the part of the best father ever. But the track that immediately follows is Mother I Sober. You might be confused to think that this is another example of Kendrick's non-linear storytelling. He did some of this in To Pimp a Butterfly, and he loved doing this on Damn. I wouldn't blame you for thinking this way, but I have a different interpretation. As a man in therapy for similar reasons as Kendrick, I can attest firsthand how difficult resolving trauma can be. There are moments of revelation that feel utterly euphoric, and other moments when we relive that trauma in vivid detail. The road to recovery is hard and messy. This album reconciles these two superpositions. Sometimes you're your confident, arrogant self. Other times you're the scared and vulnerable child. Trauma doesn't go away, but it can be handled. The urge to suppress pain is strong, but if you give yourself the space to feel and process it, you can manage it. We need to feel what we need to feel. Otherwise, the feelings we try to hide will control us. This album is messy because Kendrick's emotions are messy. The song We Cry Together is a masterclass in showcasing how an abusive relationship can be held together by hate sex. Taylor Page's voice acting goes far in conveying the sex politics that empowers generational trauma. Kendrick must admit that while black women and black men face many of the same traumas, their experiences are still different. Empathy is understanding that nuance without creating a hierarchy of whose pain is greater. Conversely, the song Purple Hearts is easily the worst track on this album. The beat is fine, but some of the lyrics are strange. Summer Walker was a poor decision to feature on this track, and I say this as a Summer Walker fan, please don't kill me. Her line,
"It ain't love, you gon' judge me for my past. No, it ain't love if you never read my ass,"
is a sentiment I both deeply agree with and think should not have been included in this track. Maybe I'm the asshole who's missing a deep metaphor there, but this song was a snooze fest. The song felt uncanny and foreign, something I never thought I would say about a track on a Kendrick album. Fortunately, there was a pleasant surprise in the form of Auntie Diaries, a song about transgender acceptance. Kendrick tells a story of ingrained homophobia and transphobia in his community, something he was raised with as a child. He had to reconcile both loving his trans family members while repeatedly causing them harm, either through his words, his actions, or his silence. He picked family over faith and reconciled with his trans family members, addressed his own hypocrisy in the process. He used the F slur over 14 times in the song, while admitting that for many trans people, it would be as uncomfortable to them as it was for him to hear a white woman say the N-word. It's interesting that he comes to this conclusion because he still uses the F slur in his song. Many queer folks were critical of his artistic choices, and I can empathize with that frustration. Kendrick addresses his own Messiah complex and admits his lack of purity. He would much rather show his authentic experience and perspective than don the politically correct filter. He does the same thing again by including Kodak Black on many of his tracks. This is a rapper who pled guilty for first-degree assault and battery charge of a high school girl. He's not a good dude. In polite society, we would shun him, but Kendrick is not interested in moral purity. He wants the dirt to be front and center. He would much rather be raw and offend someone's sensibilities than compromise his message. You don't have to agree with him or even listen to the album. If you want to cancel it, that's valid too, but this is an album of contradictions. There is trauma and healing, pride and humility, messiahs and false prophets. I find it increasingly difficult to rate this album. Art conveys a message, and as critics, we have to evaluate how clear or poignant that message is to the audience. It's impossible to judge this album because this is a story of Kendrick's grief. If everyone grieves differently, then there isn't a metric by which we can evaluate how compelling his grief is. One metric I can quantify, though, is the social good afforded by Kendrick's message. It is difficult to talk about sexual assault, especially if you're a man. While women are far more frequent targets. There are far more social apparatuses to afford them comfort. Men aren't viewed as attractive victims and given far less sympathy for similar situations. Toxic masculinity and patriarchy are to blame. They help create this rape culture that's steeped in victim blaming and obfuscation. If a woman, a socially acceptable victim, faces harassment for telling her story, what hope is there for a man to find his justice? We need to take better steps in creating a space for victims to come forward and investigate all accusations to ensure that we do our due diligence to hold abusers accountable. This album does the former. If a massive star like Kendrick can be honest about his trauma, then any man can. My hope for this album is that men find the motivation to take their mental health into their own hands and fight for themselves. So in conclusion, this album is flawed but brilliant. It's raw and it's intense in a way that most polished albums could never replicate. It isn't for everyone, but for those who relate with the message of masculinity, it is a beautiful masterpiece. As of recording this, I would say this is the best album of 2022 and definitely worthy of another Pulitzer. This has been The Dialectic with Anirudh Garg. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Any support for this video to grow its traction will help me make more of this content and talk about a multitude of different issues. This is just one.